Center for Global Enterprise is a brand new think tank, and think tanks don't pop up very often. And when they do, they typically focus on things like national security or education. This think tank was founded in 2013 by the former CEO and chairman of IBM, focused on the challenges that he faced as a CEO, which was how do you run a large enterprise that is engaged in building relationships and value across more than 200 countries around the world. And it's interesting, when you look around at think tanks, there are very few, if any, that focus on the enterprise, even though the enterprise is central to wealth creation and prosperity and modernity. And I was tapped to lead the research initiatives. And so they gave me a year, actually, to study the firm in various topics, and I picked three, and one of them was the rise of the platform economy. And one of the things that I discovered was that there is a gap. There are lots of, well, I wouldn't say lots, but there's an emerging literature on platforms, but there's not actually a strong empirical base of data to say, well, what are these platforms? Which companies are and which are not? I actually would say that General Electric is not a platform. It has elements and aspirations to become a platform, and I can talk more about that. Anyway, so we just published a book called Growing Global, and that's an event we held at Columbia University, and we're now in the process of building up a variety of sponsors, and we're very excited. We've just landed a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to do work on platform development in Africa, which is quite interesting, and we work with a variety of universities around the world. So what I'd like to do is launch into the results of more than a year of effort that involved scholars from around the world, and I'll introduce you to some of them, to do an assessment and build a database. And I must say that it's not a perfect database, but it's pretty good, and it's much better than what was out there before. I have good data on the publicly traded platforms, but not the privately traded platforms, so this direct jobs numbers comes from the publicly traded companies. Obviously, there's a bunch of private platforms out there. It's much harder, almost impossible to get jobs data for them. So if you tally up the publicly traded companies, and these are companies that have valuations of $1 billion or more. So I'm really just looking at the very large platforms around the world. You're looking at 1.5 million direct jobs, but there are literally millions of other people that are employed as a result of platforms. A couple of highlights before I jump into the data. Platform growth, we're seeing them grow in size and scale and across more sectors, and are truly becoming global in their scope. And I think if there's one big takeaway I'd like you to have today is we need to think about these as global corporations, not just little small startups or interesting websites and things. They have become the new, potentially, the new multinationals. Platforms don't exist evenly across the world. There are some areas or regions of the world where you're seeing a lot of platform growth, and there's others where there's not. And so it's interesting to look at Europe, which my data suggests is lagging, not just a little, but actually quite substantially. And I think it's a concern, and one of the things we're interested in is why is that happening and what can be done about it. And then the management. If you're in a firm, how do you create a platform? How do you manage platforms? And the techniques that you would learn in a traditional MBA course actually might not be fit for purpose, because managing a platform is different, and so you need different management skills. Tons of talk about unicorns, but it's a label. It doesn't tell you much about why a unicorn is a unicorn. And what's interesting is that we did some analysis last summer, and it turns out about 70% of the unicorns are actually platform companies. Right? And it makes sense because they scale, the investors like them, right? Because there's the potential for a big payoff. So I think it's important to dig behind the unicorn story and understand what is driving this. Is it because, you know, some people would say, the macroeconomists would say, well, it's low interest rates, and so there's just hot money flying around, and so they've dumped them into these companies, and well, what companies did they dump the money into? It turns out a lot of them are platform companies. Technology shifts, Roger alluded to this. What is really interesting if you dig into this story, so this is in the transportation space, and this goes to this point that platforms are moving into new sectors. They're moving out of books and, you know, Facebook and things, and they're moving into real stuff like automobiles. If you go and you look at the funding, this is out of Crunchbase. Zipcar was really the only company that was getting any VC funding up until 2007. Does anybody know who owns Zipcar now? Avis, correct. So that's one way traditional companies get into the platform space. They go and buy them, right? 2008, just an amazing thing happened. More than $4 billion flooded into the transportation space, right? And suddenly they realized there was a new infrastructure that had been built, right? It wasn't just the smartphone. It was the fact that Google Maps existed. And if you look at this one, Uber was down here. It was actually below Lyft. It's quite interesting in 2009. And then Uber jumps up and is, now I haven't done the latest round, but they're now valued at something like $60 billion. The first big investment in Uber was by which company? Google. Why would Google invest $500 million? It wasn't a small investment. It was $500 million pretty early on, right around in here. What does Uber use? It's essential to their business that Google has. Google Maps. Uber cannot exist without Google Maps. I think that when you look at the size and scale of these platforms now, it is truly stunning, and they are now multinational corporations. And I just throw up a few here as just examples. Airbnb now does business in 190 countries around the world. The listings in Paris alone, 28,000 listings. And globally, they're in 34,000 cities. It's stunning. Netflix has just done a big global rollout recently, and they're now in 190 countries. LinkedIn now has over 400 million users. And they have offices all over the world now, and they're in over 200 countries, and they are now buying. Do you know lynda.com? They bought lynda.com. They also bought SlideShare. So they're building the capability to do the next generation of training, and they're targeting corporate training. Google Play has 4 services. You've got the apps, you've got books, you've got movies, and you've got music. To fully appreciate what Google has done, you have to look at the global map. This is it is truly global now. And of course, not all 4 services are offered everywhere. But they're offered just about everywhere except China. I won't speak too much about this, but I think it's important to understand that, and if you like academics, you'd spend lots of time debating the firm versus the market. But what's really interesting about platforms is that they challenge the traditional shift or the tendency to bring things within the firm. That platforms allow you to move things outside of the firm, right? So Uber doesn't employ the drivers directly. It facilitates that employment. The same thing with Airbnb, and you could go through multiple platforms. And so what that's happening is because digital is very efficient and it allows you to do things that the market is better at, right? In the past, there were lots of efficiencies. You needed managers, you needed firms to do the coordination, and now that can happen outside the firm. So what is the firm becomes a very interesting question when you speak about platforms. And I would say it's also reshaping enterprise structure, and this comes directly out of doing this research, which is if you look at kind of the quintessential the poster children of platforms, which are the Airbnb and Uber, you'll find that their traditional organizations are very lean, right? They have a very small headquarters and very small number of direct employees, but they're managing huge platforms. So Apple has a huge platform. The App Store is this huge thing, but they also have manufacturing and traditional, and they actually have quite a number of employees. I think they have close to 100,000 employees. So they have kind of a mixed situation. And then we have kind of the traditional firms, what I call asset heavy, which would be your Daimler, for example, right? They manufacture automobiles, and so their organization is really set up for manufacturing. However, they've recognized the power and value of platforms, and so Daimler has launched an experiment called Movable, and so they've been making some acquisitions to try to get into the platform space. I don't know if you're aware that 5 of the major platforms now have much bigger market capitalizations than GE does. When we talk about platforms, we have to recognize the variation in how they're not just these new digital companies, but can also be created by traditional incumbents. And it also affects how the firm engages the workforce. So we all know the traditional setup for a traditional firm, which is you have core employees and then you have contingent workers that are hired when you need. But now we have this whole new world of potential cloud workers. And there's two ways that those cloud workers can be engaged. You can have public clouds in which they tap into those. And recently, they've been studying these private enterprise clouds. And I don't have a lot of time to dig into that, but that is really interesting because these are people that would be pre-vetted and gone through the HR system, and they're just sitting out there potentially to be tapped by firms. Google apparently now uses this and have more than 4,000 people on their private talent cloud. Let me jump into the results of the survey. The survey was made possible by building relationships with academics that study platforms in different parts of the world. It's too complicated and it's too hard, and that's why I think a lot of the media attention around platforms is very narrow. And so what I felt is that platforms, it's not really easy to know what they are, and so you need to go to the experts that have spent a lot of time thinking about them and iterate with them and debate with them. This is a framework that Annabelle and I developed. We use these to distinguish different types of platforms, right? You have transaction platforms that are really about the matching component. And then you have innovation platforms where really it's about how do you encourage third parties to build things on your platform. And then you have integrated, which marry these two. And these guys are where the real wealth generation is taking place. And then you have a few that build portfolios of platforms around the world. And those are really interesting because they recognize that having a portfolio of platforms can be an interesting business proposition. Okay, so the data that you get from publicly traded companies doesn't tell you what's happening in the private world. And so a lot of the work I did was to sort out private companies from the publicly traded companies. The media tends to love these. I mean, there are tons and tons of articles written about them, but actually Uber is right here. And you can see that Uber's great, but it isn't the entire platform story by any matter of means. So here's the breakout by region around the world, and you can see that the vast majority of the large platforms in the world, according to our database, are found in North America. And 99% of those are in the United States. It's really been the epicenter of the creation of the platforms, and we count 64. Asia is very interesting. There's actually more in Asia now. There are 82, but the valuations are lower. So, and the reason is that Asia tends to have transaction platforms, whereas the US you have transaction platforms plus integrated platforms. You can see how far behind Europe is. Only 27 we were able to identify, and not much in terms of valuation. And then you've got around Africa and Latin America. And then it becomes interesting to break them out by these types. And you can see the integrated platforms are these big ones like the Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple. Alibaba we would put in there because they have some of the elements of transaction but also innovation. And again, you can see where Europe stacks up is lagging, and they lack any of the big innovation platforms. E-commerce is really interesting as well, particularly because we're seeing the diffusion of these platforms into the emerging markets. The action is that they know how to do them, they know how to build these architectures. It's really about moving them into these new markets. And the other thing that's interesting is that they're beginning to constitute a bigger share of the merchandise trade. And some of the big platforms like Amazon are beginning to backward integrate. In the past, they left logistics to other companies like FedEx and UPS. They're beginning to realize with the surge, because these guys can suddenly do a snap sale, and then you're talking about not a few packages, you're talking about, in the case of Alibaba, they ran Singles Day in November, something like 800 million packages. That is a material impact on your logistics system. I found it fascinating that the UK government signed an agreement with Alibaba to help UK merchants put their wares on Alibaba's platform to sell into China. I just want to highlight the growth of Asia. Totally underreported story. There are lots of platforms in Asia that are emerging, particularly in China. Beijing actually comes second in the world in terms of numbers of platforms, second only to the Silicon Valley or San Francisco area. Then you have Shanghai and then Hangzhou. This is where Alibaba is from, and so there's a little cluster there. So platforms and innovation, if I look at cities that have 4 or more major platforms, this is what you get. And you can see that the San Francisco Bay Area dominates with 44, and the valuation is stunning. The valuation there is over $2 trillion in the valuation of those 44 companies. And I don't think people fully appreciate what that means. These guys have a lot of money. They can do more things. They can go out and buy more platforms. They can do these moonshot things. They get people's attention, like the driverless car. They can do lots and lots of stuff. And then there's the rest of the world. I think, again, underreported what's going on in Asia. And the question is can they shift from being transaction platforms to being innovation platforms? And that's an open question. But there's a lot of innovation. And this is where the bulk of the world's population lives and really the bulk of GDP. So I think it makes a whole lot of sense that we're seeing growth of platforms in that region. This is getting a lot of attention. These are the big 5 platforms. These companies all have bigger valuations than General Electric. Total valuation as of, this is a little older, and this has come off a bit, but $2 trillion just in those companies. So they're very big, and they're pumping money into innovation. So these are the numbers of patents that were awarded in 2014 for these 5 companies. Almost 9,000 patents. Investment. As I mentioned, there's a few companies out there that are building portfolios. They're almost like holding companies for platforms. Koers Becker is quite an interesting story, South African. He invested $31 million in Tencent. That is now worth $66 billion. So he's got a lot of money, and he's around building a portfolio of platform companies. So I finished with Annabelle the global survey, and so right now I'm working with the other scholars to do deeper dives in each one of these sectors. There's a lot of kind of nuance that is region specific about what's going on in Africa, what's going on in India, what's going on in Europe, and what's going on in China. So if you find this interesting, I'm happy to share this slide deck and other work that we're doing. And thank you very much. And Annabelle's up next. Thank you.